This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Poet laureates do a lot more than write poetry. They promote poetry and literature in the communities they serve. Since 1985, Connecticut State Poet Laureates have visited schools, performed spoken word, and passed on poetry onto the next generation of writers. And it's not just the state. Some towns and cities also have their own poet laureates. Today, 3 poets from around Connecticut join us in the studio. They each had a different path to becoming a poet laureate. Some have been writing poetry all their lives, while others got bitten by the poetry bug a little bit later. Nadia Sims is the Manchester Poet Laureate, Frederick Douglass Knowles II is the Hartford Poet Laureate, and Antoinette Brimbell is the Connecticut State Poet Laureate. Thank you to all 3 of you for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having us.
And for our listeners, I know we have poets out there. If you have a poem, a haiku, or just a comment to share with us, join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And also before today's program, we asked Connecticut public staff to share their haikus. And we have quite a few poets in this building. Here's one from Senior Project Manager of Talk and Storytelling, Meg Fitzgerald. Public radio, an information sandwich. Never go hungry.
Bars. I like that.
Isn't that amazing? Well, nice. Meg, you just made us hungry for more poetry, I think. So thank you so much, Meg, for sharing that with us. And so I want to start the conversation with Antoinette. You know, we're going to be talking about poetry today. How were you first introduced to the genre? And tell us about your background as a poet and your origin story.
I like that. When you say origin story, it makes me feel like a superhero. My grandmother always gifted me books, you know, for whatever holiday or whatever the reason. Never toys, but always books. And she gave me a collection of African-American poetry. And I don't ever remember having read like Dr. Seuss or any of those other more age-appropriate types of poetry, because my mother and grandmother had no concept of what was like age-appropriate. It's like, oh, here's a book, read it. And so at 7, I was reading Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks, but the Langston Hughes dream poem, for some reason, impacted me. I think the language was clear and succinct enough for a 7-year-old to grasp. And I knew I liked the language. I knew I liked the way it looked on the page. And I felt like I needed to be a poet. And I wanted to write like that. It's a little funny story I tell about myself is after I read that particular poem, I read Gwendolyn Brooks' The Bean Eaters, and totally misunderstood the poem. I was only 7. I thought basically it meant that if you were going to be a poet, you had to eat beans. Oh.
What's for breakfast?
Yeah. So silly. You know, you got to look up the poem. I was so off. But you know, my mom wasn't thrilled with the whole notion of growing up to be a poet. She wanted me to do other things, but I was like, no, I'm willing to be a poet and eat beans.
Those beans were calling to you. So how did you go from reading poetry to actually starting to write it?
I think shortly after that, I received a little blue plastic typewriter for Christmas. Nice. And I, you know, banged out with my little fingers my very first attempts at poetry. And because I was always reading and not playing and being fascinated by all of these worlds in the books that were laying around the house, you know, back in the 70s, whatever was on the New York Times bestseller list, people would put it on their coffee tables. So when they had people come over, you know, you looked well read. And I was just reading, you know, whatever was out and enjoying it. And I just kind of realized you could go anywhere in your imagination.
Well, I think it's amazing that you had that discovery at 7 years old and that stayed with you for so long. And Nadia, I want to ask you too, because you also were attracted to poetry as a child, but you didn't get into it until later.
So I didn't start performing poetry until 2020, but I had been writing poetry my whole life. Like I was the student in elementary school who would go on a field trip and then like we saw Remember the Titans and then I would write a poem about Remember the Titans and get on the intercom the next day and be like, hey students, I have a poem. Like, like I was that
So
girl.
it's like a movie review.
Yeah, like, but
That's beautiful.
here's my stanzas, and I would rewrite Dr. Seuss and stuff like that because poetry was it was a language for me. It was how I interpreted the world. I didn't have the patience for journaling, but I could put a quick 4 bars together and just get how I was feeling out.
Well, it's amazing you say a quick 4 bars, but we all know that it can be challenging
Yeah.
to get those bars.
Writing a book is so different.
Well, and then a different kind of challenging. I think 2020 was a challenging time for a lot of people for many different reasons, right? So what was going on with you that you decided that that was the moment that you had to go deep into your poetry and even start performing it, like you were saying?
Because there was a space where the world's shutting down. I'm at home. I'm in my feelings. And I was like, I just feel like my gifts are unemployed. I'm still managing to pay my bills. But if I met my maker today and he goes, what did you do with the gifts I gave you? What did you do with the voice I gave you? I would have nothing to say other than I stopped writing poetry when I was like 15. So I decided, okay, I'm going to get back to it. I'm going to write because I have so many things in me. I have so many things to say. So I started going to open mics. My sister took me to 3 open mics a week, to karaoke 2 other times a week. We would go Sunday, Monday, Thursday, sometimes on Friday, sometimes on Saturday, and just get in front of crowds and get used to performing. Because I knew I wanted to do a book and I knew I wanted to do a showcase, but I had never performed before in front of like people, a crowd that was there for me. So my first performance is paper shaking. I'm sitting like, if you look on the YouTube, there's me shaking, my voice is quivering, but I survived. And then I figured out how to survive anywhere and how to do it in front of anyone. And I used to perform in front of like rappers. So I was used to performing in front of people who were used to distractions and dancers and lights and music. But somehow I had to make them listen to me. So I learned how to be dynamic, and I just decided if I was going to do it, I was going to do it with everything I had. And I wasn't going to let anything stop me.
Well, you're going to follow up with that, Frederick Douglass. But you first found poetry when you connected. You connected with poetry when you were an undergrad. And so, can you talk about that journey and what were you first influenced by?
I definitely will, but I just want to comment that we did a reading back in May for Problem Gambling in New London, Connecticut. It was called Bet on Black. And it was my first time sharing the stage, the mic with Nadia, and just hearing her story right now, like, what are you talking about? Because she blazed it down. Like, you're just like, I just started like that.
Trial by fire.
Yeah, well, burn it down, sister. Burn it down.
Thank you.
Yeah, I started in undergrad, and I was a sociology major. And I had this really cool professor. I forgot her name, but she was like short and she was like a hippie and she had like long skirts and so forth, long hair and like these grandma sweaters that she would wear. But she introduced me to Black authors. She introduced me to Nathan McCall, Makes Me Want to Holler, Autobiography of a LA Gangster by Monster Cody. So it was my first time reading Black male authors. I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, predominantly white school, and so the literature, of course, didn't reflect, me. And so it was just like, whoa, okay. And I always had these ideas in my mind and thoughts and so forth. And just in her class one day, I just started channeling, just started going off. And then I realized, like, oh, this is pretty nice, right? I read some, I was like, okay. I mean, I swear they were gold then, but now I look back like, you know what? No one will ever read these poems. But the energy, the catalyst of it all. And I had a friend who said that there was open mics in Hartford at the time. And so I was driving from Norwich, where I lived in Black Rose City, and I would drive up Route 2 all the time to come to these open mics and met a collective of artists. And it was just like you said, dancers and painters and, rappers and so forth, all at this open mic. It was right across the street from the Amtrak station. It was called The Junction at Signatures Cafe. And it was this is 99, 2000, and it was just awesome. And I caught the bug. And from there, then in 2001, we got the first slam team in Hartford to go to Seattle, Washington. And that's when I was like, yo. Like, there was a 24-hour open mic at this diner. What? So imagine like all these poets emerging into downtown Seattle or downtown Hartford, whatever. And this one diner had a 24-hour mic. So after all the battles and so forth, all the poets just hang out at the diner and the mic's right there. And it was never empty. And I was like, yes.
See, I'm still caught on, I'm going to need to read those poems that baby Frederick Douglass wrote.
Not baby Douglas poems.
Title of your next book.
I got a couple baby Douglas poems.
So how was it poetry and not rap? Like, how did you not go into rap?
Well, it was rap earlier, like, of course, in the 80s. You know, I'm a hip hop baby, born in '73, and so it was rap. You know, growing up and so forth. But growing up in Connecticut, it felt so distant from New York City.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Social media now and technology has bridged that gap. But for us growing up, it was just such a world away. You know, watching the videos and be like, oh my God, those guys are like stars, and you know, we emulate it, but never took it seriously and so forth. And then it melded into poetry, and it came out, and I was like, yeah, this sounds about right.
Well,
you know?
you talk about that melding, and I think poetry, it transcends, right, the borders of genres, of mediums and media. And Antoinette, you know, like we've been talking about so far, poetry is not your only passion, right? You also are a print artist.
Yes.
So can you talk about how did that first came into this and connect with your poetry?
I was on my way to work one day and was rear-ended by this big, white bread truck kind of situation, and received a really substantial concussion. And so for a while, I kind of lost access to language.
Oh, wow.
But what I did have in place, I guess your brain always finds a way, images of colors and shapes and those things kind of replaced how I processed things. And my son gave me a birthday gift of a printmaking class at the Creative Arts Workshop downtown New Haven on Audubon. And what I learned was when I was there in the printmaking studio, I didn't have headaches. There was no pain. And there would just be soft jazz playing in the back. And so whenever I would think of things or see things, I always processed them into meaning through visual images. And then as time went on and I started to heal, then those two things started to live side by side. There was a time I thought I would never write again, but when I did heal, I hadn't lost either of those things. So now, when I'm thinking about a topic or a piece of art comes to mind, my brain kind of says, I think this is something that is best depicted in images and color and texture. And sometimes it comes to me in language the way it used to. And so now
So you found a different language.
I found a different language. Poetry was my first language. But yeah, I guess now I have another one too.
Well, and I think language itself too is also very transcending, much like poetry, like we're talking about today. And Nadia, you really dove into poetry after starting your spoken word. And I was exposed to spoken word in college, and it was the first time that I saw a performance and realized how powerful poetry can be when it's literally spoken. I think kind of like certain Shakespearean plays, I think they're meant to be performed for you to feel the power. And I remember feeling that moment as like a sophomore, junior in college. So what happened at that initial performance, like you mentioned earlier, that you were quivering and whatever, but Frederick Douglass says you were not. Was it?
Like
it that moment?
There's a difference between 2020 Nadia and 2024 Nadia.
So did you realize you had something there?
Yes. Okay. So my first performance was at a small place. It was at Studio 860 in Bloomfield. They did an open mic portion and I signed up. I'm there. I got a turban on. My sister's in the audience. Okay, if nobody else claps, my sister will clap for me. Right? So I was like, and if anybody tries to boo me, Jaleesa take care of it. So I'm there, and my paper is shaking, and I'm hiding. The paper is like past my nose. Like I'm not looking at these people. I don't want to look at these people. I'm hiding. But I read this poem about how to hear God, right? It's a poem about being 250 and how a man has never picked me up, but they've always wanted to lay me down. And what I needed to, and how I've always loved women, been surrounded by women, right? And my sister is one of the women I mentioned in my poem, right? And I'm the paper is shaking, it's rattling. The mic is next to the paper rattling, right? But I finish and I put the paper down and I see women in the crowd crying.
Wow.
And I see men in the crowd rubbing their chest. They ain't saying nothing, but they're rubbing their chest, right? And I'm like, oh, I just did something. I don't know what I did, but I did something. And then I get off the stage and I'm making my way to my sister, and a woman stops me and she goes, I've always felt like that, and I never had the words for it. And you just gave me the words for something I didn't know was in my spirit, right? And she's like, can I hug you? And I go, it's COVID, but cool. We both masked up. We can, let's hug. And that happened show after show where I'm saying these things, these thoughts that are in my body, in my mind that I struggled to get out. And I'm seeing people go, no, that healed me. That helped me. That made me feel something. And I'm like, oh, I can do that. I just got to get comfortable. I've always struggled with authenticity. I've always felt like somebody was going to stand up and go, you're not a real poet.
Yeah.
But as soon as I started to claim my words and my feelings and go, no, I feel these things. I wrote these things. I mean these things. That's when I discovered my power. And now I'm Superwoman. You can't tell me nothing. Like,
You can't tell her
you
nothing.
can't tell me nothing. Like, you can try.
Well, and that's the perfect note to share that you got a listener hug on Facebook.
Oh, nice.
Like, I'm hugging you back.
Donna Powell shares that we love Nadia and are so grateful for all the journeys she takes us on with her words and spirit. Well, thank you so much, Donna, for sharing that with us.
Hugs.
Well, and that's perfect too because Nadia will be helping us finish off this segment today. I believe you brought a poem to read for us, and before we end the segment, could you read it to us and tell us why this poem?
So this is a portion of A Soft Place to Land. It is the message that I carry with me to give myself a little grace and to remind myself that I'm human. So the poem goes, we all fall, lose our minds, lose ourselves to the world around us, to the swirls within us. We all fall, but the gift of grace, the room to be ugly, the room to be in pain and out of bounds, the room to love as is without spiritual makeup, deception, or exception is an act, is a kindness. What a glorious thing it is to be someone's soft place to land.
Well, thank you so much for landing that for us. You were listening to Manchester Poet Laureate Nadia Sims performing her poem, A Soft Place to Land. She's joining us in the studio with Hartford Poet Laureate Frederick Douglass Knowles II and Connecticut State Poet Laureate Antoinette Brimbell. Coming up, we learn what it means to be a poet laureate and talk about their paths to this position. And listeners, if you have a poem, a haiku, or just a comment to share with us, join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And here's a haiku from our executive editor, Eric Austin. My teens are crazy. Can't wait for school to start soon. Homework and soccer.
Bars. Bars. This is a talented group here.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Anyone can write poetry, but the path from poet to poet laureate isn't always a direct one. Our guests today are just some of the poet laureates from around Connecticut. With us is Connecticut State Poet Laureate Antoinette Brimbell, Hartford Poet Laureate Frederick Douglass Knowles II, and Manchester Poet Laureate Nadia Sims. So jumping straight to it with Frederick Douglass here. So not all towns and cities in Connecticut have poet laureates, and you're actually Hartford's very first poet laureate. So
Very first.
congratulations on that.
Thank
How
you.
did that come about?
Well, yeah, I had a friend reach out and say that Hartford was looking for their very first poet laureate, and I was very excited. And then so it was a process. I had to apply for it. There was the Connecticut Cultural Commission here in Hartford, so I had to apply with them and get a green light from them, a stamp from them. So that was the first step, and then the second step was I had to meet the mayor at the time, Mayor Bronin. I had to get his stamp of approval as well, which I did, and then I had to meet with city council and get all their stamps of approval. So it was a lengthy process that took several months and so forth. And walking through those three, I got their stamps of approval. I received the appointment, and I was very excited. And right when I received it, a reporter from the Hartford Courant had did an article about it and so forth. And the moment that article came out, the phone just started ringing. Like people were excited. They didn't know there was a poet laureate, a first one. And the community just really, really embraced me all around churches, libraries, schools. And it was a great opportunity to just be like, yeah, this is poetry.
Well, and you just talked about, a lot of people didn't realize this position exists. So what does it mean for you to be able to be in this role and to do what you're doing?
Man, I mean, and I know my other fellow poets can attune to this too, but it's an opportunity to really be like a poetic ambassador, to show people, like Nadia was saying, like she shared her poems. She didn't know the magnitude until she looked up, and people were just crying and hugging, and we don't know what our reaction will be, when people hear us and so forth. We just know that we have a responsibility, well, I can speak for myself, have a responsibility to really just share, right? And talk about the things that people can't talk about, don't want to talk about, don't know how to talk about or express themselves. And, it's the universe saying, you know what, here's a gift for you, but it's not just for you.
Right.
Right? It's for everyone. And I'm like, everyone? It's like everyone.
Well, you mentioning for everyone. I think for many people, when poetry is being written, oftentimes it's a self-expression. So how do you express an entire city? What does it mean to capture the city of Hartford and representing Hartford?
Just simply looking at the people. Looking at the people, and not only look at them, but being amongst them, right? I mean, they are my muse. Like, the community is my muse. And so I'm not sheltered up in a room somewhere, out of touch with what's happening outside my door and so forth. Some folks can write like that. I can't. So being amongst the people, seeing their stories, hearing their stories, and being able to capture them, you said earlier, being authentic and authenticity, right? And really walking the walk and talking the talk. So having that, the opportunity to do so has been very bountiful and extreme blessing.
Well, Nadia, you've been nodding at what Frederick Douglass is saying, and you're representing Manchester in this position. So, you went on, you were performing, and then you became the next poet laureate for Manchester. So, what did that look like for you?
It looked like I did a showcase at the end of my first year of performing, and Ryan Parker, the poet laureate at the time in Manchester, saw a news segment on Fox about it, and he reached out and he said, "Hey sis, let's be family." And I said, "Cool, I like family." And he became right, and he became kind of like a poetry mentor to me. And he was the second poet laureate in Manchester, and he had been appointed by Julia Paul. And he goes, "I would like to appoint you. Let's navigate this together." And like Frederick said, it was a process of, okay, I want to do this nomination. These are her credentials. This is what I think she can do. She's powerful. At the time, I'd only had one book out, so I had a couple years to get a resume together. That means I'm doing shows. I'm coming out with my book. I'm coming out with my poetry album. I'm coming out with my children's book. I'm being featured in Massachusetts, New York, in different places in Connecticut. Because Manchester was the last place to know about me. Even though I was in their own backyard, they did not know who Nadia Sims was. You went to Springfield, you went to Bridgeport, you go to Hartford, people know my name. You go to Manchester, they're like, who? That girl up the street, what? So by the time the Arts Council got around to saying, okay, Ryan Parker's really leaving, we need a new poet laureate. Who is this Nadia Sims? Now I'm Nadia Sims with a resume. Now I'm Nadia Sims and I'm confident. And I can go in front of your Arts Council and say, this is who I am. And you like it, or you're just going to have to live with me being in your town doing poetry anyway. Like
I'm not going anywhere.
You know what I mean? Because the poetry doesn't stop.
Right.
You can give me the position or not, but
Well,
guess
now-
what?
yeah.
I'm not going to hit 91 every time I want to do poetry. So I'm going to be doing poetry in Manchester. You can do it with me. We can do it as a collective.
So how are you doing that collectively?
So now it's a matter of I work with the town to say, okay, we just became a cultural arts district. The goal of that is to bring poetry and entertainment and arts to Manchester. Let us work together to show people that more than restaurants and the mall happen in Manchester. That we have a downtown with local shops and locally talented people who are hungry to do poetry. So they started off with giving me a 3-series open mic series, Intimacy, which comes back in September. Show up for me, people, you know. And it looks like, okay, now we're going to local businesses. We're going to get artists paid. You're going to be paid for your poetry. You're going to be given spaces to practice, and you're going to be given a stage where you get time to work on your craft. And it's in your backyard, and you don't have to drive an hour away to do poetry. You can do it right here in Manchester and eat next door. So that is the current mission.
So the theme "Poetry is Food," I think, is very much on theme today. We started off the conversation with having this hunger for poetry, and I want to share a comment that we got on Twitter from Aaliyah. She says, "The poetry theme show this morning, feeling the serenity and grace from the poets in the studio. I started my writing journey with poetry around the age of 8. I miss it. You have me thinking it's time to revisit. Hashtag Poetry Saves Lives."
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Aaliyah, for sharing your story with us. And just a reminder for our listeners that if you have a poem, a haiku, or a comment that you want to share with us, like Aaliyah just did, feel free to give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Antoinette, want to jump back to you too. Earlier, you told us the origin story about how you got into poetry. So what was your journey like getting to the poet laureate position? Because I think very similarly to your fellow poets here, it's not a straight path.
No, not always. I started writing at 7, continued to write, and then of course you hit all of the teenage angst, and your
Naturally.
poetry gets even,
We're all nodding
Start
here.
bleeding on the
yes,
page.
exactly.
I have feelings.
Yes, I have feelings, and because I'm a kid, I can't really express them openly, so I'm going to put them on the page. Then I went to undergraduate, and I was very fortunate to be able to major in literature and language with an emphasis in creative writing poetry. So, lots and lots of poetry, lots of writing, all of that kind of stuff. And when I graduated, my mentor and advisor, David Kluhl, said to me, Antoinette, don't let life happen. And I said, what do you mean? He said, lots of times we're all fired up and then life happens. And I said, oh, David, that'll never happen to me. I've been writing poetry since I was 7. And then 10 years later, I called him and said, and all I said was, David, life happened. And he said, yeah. He said, it does sometimes. And he said, okay, so find a class close to you and jump in and just get connected again. And that's exactly what I did. And what I realized was that 10 years of not writing was incubation time.
Ooh.
I had a lot stored up in the inside of me. You know, during that time, I'd had like 3 kids, and, you know, we all live a lot of different
Right.
lives.
Right.
Yeah. And so I had lived a lot of different lives, and then I had taken care of my mother-in-law while she was dying of cancer, and that kind of gave me a this notion too about life and regrets. There were things that she had wanted to do as a young woman and didn't do, and so yeah, she made me promise that I wouldn't be like her. And I was like, what do you mean? You're the nicest person I know. I absolutely love and adore you. But I came to understand that's what she meant. And that's when I decided that I would do an MFA program. Got in there, completed my program, and then I applied for Cave Canem, and which is what we call the home of Black poetry. And so, with the leadership and the constant, you know, people pouring into you and encouraging you, and the elders, you know, what are you doing? Let me see what you're doing. Read this book, try this, or whatever. Got me into a really good groove. And there was always someone there to support me because, you know, this whole notion that poets are solitary people, well, sometimes the writing is very solitary, but you've got to come out into a community that is supporting you. You know, otherwise you just feel all alone, and you have, you know, your work doesn't have an opportunity to actually get out there and be a part of the larger literary conversation. I always say that culture and history, you know, rests on, I think the arts undergirds history and culture. It's the way that we enshrine what we believe. You know, just the facts, that's very, very important. I'm a true believer in facts. But then when we have a reflection that is artistic, we have another way of looking at things, right? And so it touches us in ways that that just facts can't. And also, I think it makes empathy, right? And so that's kind of how I came to develop. No one does anything all on their own, right? We need each other. So I say all of that, you know, I'm just out there writing and living my life and having the best time in the world in the poetry world. And because of, you know, my undergraduate, graduate experience, my Cave Canem experience, there were always people around me that helped keep me in this poetry, this larger poetry world. And then one day a colleague said, yeah, you know, we would like to nominate you. And, you know, I say that the nomination, this whole notion of a poet laureateship, especially, you know, of the state, was never really on my radar. I don't know. I guess it's because it just seems so big and such an honor and such a responsibility. And so I did accept the nomination, and I, you know, like Frederick Douglass was saying, I did my application. But when I found out, I think I just stood in that one spot with my mouth open for 15 minutes, staring at the email and just saying, this is one of the most amazing things that has ever happened to me in my entire life. How am I going to embody this and step into it? And you know, my prayer before every time I do something in this role is, you know, that I advocate for poetry in such a way that it brings honor to my state. And so, yeah, that's how I got here.
Well, and it sounds like to me a different kind of life had happened to you in this way. And it feels like you've been embodying that position really a lot earlier than you think before the position literally became available to you, right? And so, with this really big role, what does it mean to be representative of the state? How do you connect when you're traveling a lot, going to different places? How has that influenced your work?
Well, I haven't written a whole lot of poetry since I've become the poet laureate, which is hilarious because when you said to bring a poem, I brought a poem I just finished that is about the state. So I think how has it influenced my writing? But how it has influenced my life, it has allowed me to totally immerse myself in the things that I love. I'm very, very fortunate to have a life that allows me to be constantly in contact with creatives, with books, with stories. I would say I've always been kind of a little nosy kid. I'm curious. I want to know what's going on out there. So my first year, I wanted to just kind of see the whole state because I knew a lot about what was going on in New Haven. I teach in Hartford, so I knew about the scene there.
Right.
But then all these little towns would send me an email and they'd say, we're a little town. Nobody ever comes here. And I'm like, I'm there. So I pretty much showed up and everywhere anyone asked me to show up. And what I realized is that Connecticut is rich in the arts and it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. Whether we're talking about slam, whether we're talking about the veterans I did a workshop with them. Their work was amazing. Vietnam veterans talking about the war and how it affected their lives. I was in New Haven at the Amistad School, third grade poets. They were absolutely amazing. It was so great. They did a whole unit on poetry. And they also did a unit on delivering their poetry. So they had this little tiny podium that was just big enough for an 8-year-old. And they would get up there with their little paper and they would just read. One particular poem from a little girl who had recently immigrated from Peru was written in both Spanish and English, and she captured the sights and the sounds and the smells of her street and what it's like to kind of inhabit that world in remembrance and in memory and then live in this new world. She was 8.
8 years old.
Oh, that's amazing.
It's crazy. It was far past anything that I pegged out on my little blue typewriter. It was just absolutely amazing. And so I've enjoyed going and seeing how the arts and particularly poetry is manifested throughout the state. And I've collaborated with the New England Ballet Theater. You were also there.
That was awesome. Yeah.
That was crazy.
Oh, it was beautiful.
We had, they asked poets to submit work, and then they assigned choreographers to actually make a ballet based on our work.
Oh, that's
Poetry.
amazing.
It was so beautiful.
It was
amazing.
really beautiful.
And I think with that note, beautiful, we'd love for you to end this segment by reading us a poem that you decided to bring to our table today.
Okay, so this is another one of those kind of collaborative situations. The Glastonbury Ekphrastic Showcase is going to be on their green. They have a fine arts and a craft show. And so 8 poets were shown 8 pieces of art and asked to write about them. So, yeah, it's going to be pretty cool. This poem begins with the epigraph, "It's a joy to be subtracted from the world." Gary Young. Upon viewing Simmons' 8 Mile River Reflections. 8 Mile River needs no audience. It shushes creation, claps hard against the rocks. It is its own call and response. Let the sun-soaked stones skip across this canvas, where amethyst lay with emerald, and colorways become thoroughfares where blues enter into rivulets of jazz. Confluence. The painter's brush meets the light this torrential river has polished into shards, atop mosaic petaled sprays, chromed into infinity. We are voyeurs, an unwelcomed convergence of wonder and worry. Leave the river to sleep in its deep shadows, where brushstrokes turn touchstones, while water-soaked air smudges graphite into an open palm that holds up the whole 8 Mile River.
You're listening to Connecticut State Poet Laureate Antoinette Brimbell, Hartford Poet Laureate Frederick Douglass Knowles II, and Manchester Poet Laureate Nadia Sims. Coming up, we talk about passing the torch to the next generation of poets. And here's a haiku from Connecticut Public Latino Initiative editor Sabrina Herrera. Ha 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 ha. Smiles ring out with shrieking joy. Fun has no volume.
Ooh, I love that. Bars.
Thanks, Sabrina, for sharing that poem with us. And for our listeners, you can also join the poetry party here, 888-720-9677, or leave us a poem on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're joined by poet laureates from across our state. But before we continue the conversation, here's a haiku from Deputy Director of Storytelling Robin Doyen-Aiken, who's sending her daughter off to college this week. Little one, you're safe. Tucked under my wing. Don't fly too far from my nest.
Oh, my heart. Wow. My heart.
We're having a lot of feelings this morning, listeners. You can also join the feels trip here, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Frederick Douglass, I think you also brought a poem that you'd like to share with us today.
Absolutely. I just want to say real quick that the authors of those haikus should be in this conversation now. Too, right?
Round table.
Round table.
You know there's a follow-up to this.
So I wrote a poem called Magical, about my mother's name. Her name is LaForest, and she was always misconstrued for a man's name. And so she had passed last year, and so when I would call the doctors and say my mom, they'd be like, well, make sure he blah, blah, blah. So I would correct them. And so there's a form called a glossa, where you take 4 lines of a poem from a poem that you like. So I have a colleague by the name of Jose B. Gonzalez. He has a poem called the Skillet Poem. So these first 4 lines are from his poem, and then I use 1 line in each stanza from there, from his poem, with a rhyme scheme. So Magical, a glossa for Jose B. Gonzalez's The Skillet Poem. Another mother poem. No more poems about the women who sculpted my poems. They who turned sweat into milk would no longer have open doors to my poems. So, Frederick, this poem is not about every twilight my sisters bathed our mother before themselves. Not about phoning the doctors at dawn, reciting my role, Frederick Knowles, calling on behalf of my mother, LaForest Knowles, that I was her son and conservator, calling to provide, clarify, or update any patient information unknown. This poem is not about our nation's inquisition for valid health insurance from yet another receptionist, surmising he should bring. I interject, you mean she, as if reciting another mother poem. No more poems about our mother's name mistook for a man's. A name pooling on a rose petal in our grandmother's garden. A name stemmed from the Spanish la, asserting femininity, rooted by the fricative F for forest, an Eden handmade by masculinity. But even God knew better. Left to Adam, he would never eaten on his own from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So if Eve had never bitten, how would we have known the serpent was deceptive? The receptionist couldn't have known about the woman who sculpted my poems, like our mother who one Halloween demanded the demon dancing inside our brother hand her the knives and release her son, or like her mother, Martha Montgomery, who divorced a preacher's son hell-bent on raising the rod instead of the child, or like her mother, Donnie Fullwood, who aimed her peacemaker at gin-soaked eyes attempting to tickle little town girls. No, this poem is not another mother poem, a woman poem, Frederick. This poem is not another poem about your wife, Anna Marie Douglas, who authored 5 children, published a household, only to die illiterate. Each doe, they who turned sweat into milk, would no longer let soul murderers chase their fawn from wilderness. Women like before us, who after our father died, told the social worker who conspired to place half of us 9 children into foster care to get the hell out of my house. Why should this poem be another mother poem? We already know whose magic soothes raspberry skin knees, decrust booger shut eyes, wiggles little piggy market toes. Women so magical, their name must be Merlin. So mystical, they refuted the prophet Jeremiah. We burn incense unto the Queen of Heaven. Silly men don't believe in the Holy Spirit of a woman. So no, closed minds may no longer have open doors to my poems. So.
Oh, wow.
You know why I love you? And I'm going to tell you. It's that when men write poems, they give other men language. They give other men tone. They learn how to speak to women. They learn how to speak about women. And there's something so beautiful about a poet handling a woman carefully in a world that does not always do that.
Wow, thank you.
Oh, you are amazing.
Thank you. I'm going through, of course, I'm going through the loss of my mom and so forth. So I really appreciate that.
But like, you give language to emotion. You teach us what to do with grief and how to speak about it. Poets are teachers. We give lessons.
Yes.
And so when you give the world language and tone, we speak to each other differently. We handle each other differently.
It's true.
Oh, so good. So good.
Well, I couldn't end the show better than that, Nadia. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Frederick Douglass, Knowles II, for sharing that with us. You've been listening to our panel of incredible poets today. State poet Antoinette Brimbell, Hartford Poet Laureate Frederick Douglass Knowles II, and Manchester Poet Laureate Nadia Sims. Thank you all so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Jean Amartruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening, and happy poetry writing and reading, everyone.